The first time I realized that Margaret was completely unhinged, I was standing in my driveway, staring at a bright red HOA violation notice taped to my front gate. The morning breeze fluttered the paper, and I squinted at it, still groggy from working a late shift the night before. The notice read, "Unauthorized gated structure. Immediate removal required." I frowned, gripping the paper tighter. This made no sense. I had every permit necessary for my reinforced steel gate. It wasn't just for privacy. My elderly father lived with me, and his safety was my #1 concern. He used a walker, and if someone ever tried to break in, I needed time to get him out safely. But according to Margaret, the self-appointed dictator of our HOA, my gate was a community eyesore. I had lived in this neighborhood for 4 years without a single issue. But the moment Margaret was elected HOA president, the power went straight to her head. It started small, letters about approved grass heights, complaints about my dad's caregiver parking in my driveway for too long. But now, she wanted my gate gone. A gate she had no authority over. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. Maybe this was just a mistake. Maybe if I talked to her like an adult, I could clear this up. That was my first mistake. Later that day, I knocked on Margaret's door. The second she opened it, I knew this wasn't going to go well. She stood there, arms crossed, lips pursed, eyes glinting with a kind of smug superiority only an HOA tyrant could master. "Oh, it's you," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. I held up the notice. "Margaret, there must be some confusion. My gate is up to code. I have the permits." She scoffed, cutting me off. "This isn't about permits. It's about maintaining the aesthetic integrity of our community." I blinked. "Excuse me." She gestured toward my house. "Look at your gate. It's not in harmony with the rest of the neighborhood. We have a certain look we want to maintain, and your monstrosity is ruining it." I clenched my jaw, feeling my patience evaporate. "My gate is reinforced because I have an elderly father who lives with me. I need security." Her smirk widened. "Well, then maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for you." That was it. I wasn't about to be bullied out of my own home. "Margaret, this gate is staying. You don't have the authority to make me take it down." Her face darkened, the smugness vanishing. "We'll see about that," she said, slamming the door in my face. That night, I installed security cameras. I had a bad feeling about this, and I was right. Less than 48 hours later, Margaret came back with her SUV. She was about to make a huge mistake. The moment my security cameras detected movement, my phone vibrated with an alert. It was just after midnight, and at first, I thought it was some random animal triggering the motion sensor. Until I checked the feed. My stomach dropped. There, idling at the base of my driveway, headlights cutting through the dark, was Margaret's SUV. I sat up in bed, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, trying to process what I was seeing. What the hell was she doing here? She wasn't just parked. She was lining herself up as if she were about to. No, she wouldn't. Would she? Before I could even finish the thought, the SUV revved its engine, growling through the night. And then she floored it. My breath caught in my throat as her vehicle lurched forward, barreling straight toward my gate. The impact was brutal. A loud crash split the silence of the night as metal clashed against metal. My reinforced steel gate barely moved, absorbing the hit, while Margaret's SUV bounced backward like it had just slammed into a concrete wall. For a second, there was nothing but the hissing sound of steam and the distant wail of a car alarm triggered by the impact. Margaret's SUV sat there, crumpled, smoke curling from the grill. I scrambled out of bed, pulling on a hoodie and running to the front door. My dad, woken by the noise, called out groggily from his room. "What was that?" "Stay inside, Dad," I shouted back, already throwing open the front door. By the time I stepped onto the porch, Margaret was outside her SUV, pacing back and forth, gripping her phone, her entire body shaking with rage. She had tried to ram through my gate, and she had failed spectacularly. I stormed down the driveway, my heart pounding. "Are you out of your damn mind?" She whirled to face me, eyes wild. "You broke my car." I stared at her, incredulous. "I broke your car? You tried to plow through my gate. What the hell were you thinking?" She jabbed a shaking, manicured finger at me. "This is your fault. If you had just taken down that ugly thing like I told you to, this wouldn't have happened." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "You just tried to ram through private property. That's literally a crime, Margaret. You do realize that, right? Her face twisted, a flicker of doubt appearing before she doubled down. This is harassment. I was trying to enforce HOA regulations. I gestured at the bent hood of her SUV and the thick metal bars of my still-standing gate. With your SUV? She huffed, flipping through her phone, then glared at me. I'll sue you for the damages. I scoffed. Oh, please. Go ahead and explain to a judge how you crashed into my property. Let's see how well that works out for you. That's when she made her next big mistake. She tried to open my gate. Despite the damage, the gate was still locked tight. She rattled the bars violently, yanking at them like a lunatic. I pulled out my own phone and started recording. Margaret, you need to leave. Now. She ignored me, still yanking at the gate. You don't belong here. This gate is a violation. You're ruining the neighborhood. That's when the floodlights kicked on, bright, blinding light washing over the driveway, illuminating everything in high contrast. Margaret stumbled backward, shielding her eyes. Turn that off. Nope, I said, my phone still recording. I want the cameras to get a good look at you trespassing on my property. She froze, her eyes darting toward the security camera mounted above the gate, the red recording light blinking. She was caught, in 4K. At that moment, I saw panic flicker across her face. She knew she had screwed up big time. She turned back toward her SUV, phone clutched in her hand, probably ready to spin some ridiculous story to the police. So I beat her to it. I dialed 911, still keeping the camera on her. Yes, I need officers at my address. Someone just attempted to ram my gate with their vehicle and is now trespassing on my property. Margaret's eyes widened. She took a step forward, her voice suddenly syrupy sweet. Wait. Let's not get the police involved. We can handle this like adults. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, you mean like how you just tried to commit property damage and intimidation? She swallowed hard. Too late. I had evidence, and Margaret was screwed. The flashing red and blue lights flooded my driveway within minutes. Margaret was still standing there, arms crossed, lips pressed so tight they were practically disappearing, while her SUV sat smoking behind her, the front bumper crumpled like an accordion. She had no escape. I stood at my gate, phone still recording, as two officers stepped out of the patrol car. One of them, a tall, no-nonsense cop with graying hair, adjusted his belt as he took in the scene. His partner, younger but with the same unimpressed expression, followed suit. Margaret, ever the delusional queen of entitlement, marched right up to him before I could even say a word. Officers, thank God you're here, she cried, throwing up her hands like some kind of damsel in distress. I need you to arrest this man immediately. I blinked. What? The older cop exchanged a glance with his partner before responding in the most bored voice I've ever heard. Ma'am, we haven't even asked what happened yet. Margaret pointed dramatically at me. He built an illegal gate and refused to comply with HOA regulations. I was forced to take action, and now my vehicle is destroyed because of his negligence. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The younger officer scribbled something in his notebook before looking at her SUV, then at the reinforced steel gate that had barely a scratch on it. So, just to clarify, you intentionally drove your vehicle into his gate. Margaret's expression twitched. I had no choice. He refused to take it down, and it was clearly in violation of neighborhood aesthetics. The older officer turned to me, his face unreadable. Sir, do you have security cameras on this property? Oh, I had been waiting for this moment. I tapped my phone screen, playing back the footage. I have everything right here. You'll see her SUV idling, then accelerating straight into my gate. I also have footage of her trespassing and attempting to force it open. I turned my phone toward them, letting them watch as Margaret's crime played out in real time. Her smirk vanished. The officers watched in silence, and I could already see it. The moment they realized exactly what kind of lunatic they were dealing with. The older cop let out a low sigh, rubbing his temple. Ma'am, you're under arrest for attempted property damage and trespassing. Margaret's face drained of all color. She stumbled backward, her voice rising to a high-pitched shriek. What? No. You should be arresting him. He's the real criminal here. He built that gate to provoke me. The younger cop let out a tired sigh. Ma'am, you drove your car into private property. That's not how the law works. I was defending the neighborhood, she screeched, her perfectly styled hair now slightly disheveled. "No, ma'am," the older officer corrected. "You were committing a crime." Margaret tried everything to talk her way out of it. She screamed. She pleaded. She threatened to sue the entire police department. But none of it mattered. By the time they had her in handcuffs, she was hyperventilating, still shrieking about HOA rights, her clipboard clattering to the ground as they led her toward the squad car. The irony. As they were loading her in, she turned to me, pure hatred in her eyes, and spat out the most ridiculous thing I'd heard all night. "You think this is over? You have no idea who you're messing with." I tilted my head. "Margaret, you just got arrested in front of your own house. I think I know exactly who I'm messing with." The officer shut the door, and the patrol car pulled away. Margaret was gone, for now. I took a deep breath, running a hand through my hair as I stared at the mess she had left behind. Her SUV was still wrecked against my gate. The entire neighborhood had watched the scene unfold, curtains pulled back, porch lights flickering on. My dad, now standing on the porch with a cup of tea, let out a low whistle. Well, that escalated quickly. I let out a bark of laughter, my adrenaline finally fading. Yeah, it did. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure. Margaret was not the kind of person who gave up easily. And if she was willing to go this far already, I had a feeling things were about to get a whole lot worse. The morning after Margaret's spectacular arrest, I stepped outside with my coffee, half expecting the neighborhood to feel different, quieter, more peaceful, now that the dictator had been temporarily removed. But the moment I opened my front door, I knew something was off. The air felt heavy, like the storm wasn't over, just changing direction. And then I saw it. A brand new violation notice taped to my gate. For a split second, I just stood there, staring at the paper like it had personally offended me. How? Margaret was literally in jail last night. How was she still finding ways to harass me? I ripped the paper off the gate and skimmed through it. Violation notice. Emergency HOA ruling. Due to ongoing disruptions caused by non-compliant structures, all homeowners with private gates must have them inspected by the HOA board within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in automatic fines and potential forced removal. I clenched my teeth. She was still trying to get rid of my gate. But this time, she wasn't doing it alone. I didn't have to guess who was behind this. I stormed over to the HOA office, and sure enough, the moment I walked through the doors, I was met with a familiar smug voice. Well, if it isn't our local troublemaker. Margaret was sitting right there, in a crisp new suit, sipping coffee like she hadn't spent last night in a police car. I froze. What the hell was going on? The HOA secretary, a frazzled-looking woman in her 50s, cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter, I assume you're here about the new inspection policy." I barely glanced at her. "What is she doing here?" Margaret smiled, a slow, satisfied smile. "Oh, you mean after your little stunt last night?" I narrowed my eyes. "You crashed your SUV into my gate, Margaret." She waved a dismissive hand, as if that was just some minor inconvenience. "That's neither here nor there. I'm back, and I've made some changes." My stomach tightened. "What changes?" The secretary shifted awkwardly. Margaret was temporarily removed from the board due to legal issues, but after an emergency vote this morning, the board reinstated her as acting HOA president. I blinked. "What?" Margaret beamed. "Oh, did you think one little misunderstanding with the police would get rid of me?" I was speechless. This woman had just committed literal property damage, and the HOA was still backing her. The secretary sighed. "The board voted unanimously, Mr. Carter. You know how much Margaret has done for this community." Oh, I knew. She had bullied, intimidated, and fined this community into submission. And now, she was back, stronger than ever. I exhaled slowly. "So let me guess. This new inspection policy is just another attempt to get rid of my gate." Margaret tilted her head innocently. "Oh, Carter, don't be so paranoid. It's just a routine inspection." I clenched my fists. "You can't just create a rule overnight and expect me to follow it." Margaret pulled out a stack of documents and slid them toward me. "Actually, I can. See, the HOA board approved this policy early this morning. Since you're such a fan of rules, I thought you'd appreciate a little administrative efficiency." I flipped through the papers, my blood boiling with every line I read. Homeowners with gates must submit a request for compliance certification. If deemed non-compliant, the HOA can issue removal orders. Fines of up to $500 per day for failure to comply. She had fast-tracked an entire rule just to screw me over. I looked back up at her, keeping my voice calm. This is harassment. Margaret's grin widened. No, Carter. This is community maintenance. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. You can't win. I will get that gate removed. I squared my shoulders. We'll see about that. I left the office furious but determined. Margaret thought she had won. She thought she had the final say. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't playing by her rules anymore. If she wanted to turn this into a war, then war is exactly what she was going to get. The first thing I did when I got home was pull out my binder. Yeah, I had a binder. Because after months of dealing with Margaret's nonsense, I had started collecting every single HOA bylaw, complaint, record, and incident report related to her leadership. And in my search, I found something golden. Margaret's entire HOA inspection rule was illegal. Buried deep in the HOA bylaws was a clause about property modifications, stating that any new policies affecting homeowners' structures required a community vote to be enforceable. Margaret hadn't held a vote. She had just forced the rule through, thinking no one would challenge her. But I was going to challenge her, and I wasn't going to do it alone. The next morning, I started knocking on doors. It was time to get the neighborhood on my side. First stop, the Johnsons. They were one of the longest-standing residents in the neighborhood, retired, quiet, and generally avoided conflict. But Margaret had fined them $200 last year for unsightly garden decorations, aka a single lawn gnome. When I explained what Margaret was trying to do, Mrs. Johnson's eyes darkened. That woman has been a menace for years. Her husband, usually soft-spoken, set his coffee cup down a little too hard. Count us in. 2 signatures done. Then I went to the Roses. Margaret had tried to fine them for putting up Christmas lights too early in December. They signed immediately. Then the Wongs, the Carters, and the Patels. Everyone had a horror story. And by the time I finished, I had over 30 signatures, more than enough to challenge Margaret's inspection rule and force a real vote. But I wasn't done yet. I needed public exposure. So I did something Margaret never expected. I went straight to social media. I created a neighborhood Facebook group titled HOA Reform, Taking Back Our Community. Within hours, it exploded. People started sharing their own Margaret horror stories. She fined me for overgrown grass when I was on vacation for 3 days. She charged me $50 because my garbage bin was too visible from the street. She tried to make me repaint my house because she didn't like the shade of beige. By the end of the day, the group had over 80 members. By the next morning, over 100. Margaret's power was crumbling, and she didn't even know it yet. Then came the final move. I emailed the HOA board with my official challenge to Margaret's new rule, citing the bylaw she had ignored. By HOA regulations, they had no choice but to schedule a formal vote. And when Margaret found out, she lost her mind. That afternoon, I was outside watering my lawn when I heard the familiar sound of heels clacking on pavement. I turned just in time to see Margaret storming toward me, her clipboard clutched in one hand, her eyes burning with fury. She stopped just inches away, her voice low and dangerous. You think you're so clever, don't you? I kept watering the lawn. Oh, I don't think, Margaret. I know. Her fingers tightened around her clipboard. You had no right to challenge my authority. I laughed. Actually, Margaret, I had every right. It's literally written in the bylaws. You should try reading them sometime. Her face twitched. You have no idea who you're messing with. I turned off the hose, tilting my head. Margaret, didn't you say that right before you got arrested? Her nostrils flared. Enjoy this little victory while it lasts, Carter. You've made a big mistake. And with that, she turned on her heel and stormed away. But as I watched her retreat, I couldn't help but smile. Because for the first time ever, Margaret was scared. The morning of the HOA vote, I woke up feeling confident for the first time since this nightmare started. It felt like Margaret was cornered. She had lost community support. She had lost her ability to manipulate the rules. And she was about to lose the final battle over my gate. Or so I thought. Because Margaret wasn't done yet. And her next move blindsided me. The first sign that something was wrong came when I stepped outside. There, standing in my driveway, was a man in a dark blue uniform, clipboard in hand, looking over my house like he was assessing a crime scene. I frowned, stepping off my porch. Can I help you? The man glanced up, adjusting his cap. The homeowner? Yeah. Building and zoning department. We received a complaint about unpermitted construction on your property. I'm here to conduct an inspection. My stomach dropped. What? Unpermitted construction? I stared at him. There's been a mistake. My gate was built legally. I have the permits. He flipped through his paperwork. According to our records, no valid permits are on file for the structure currently standing. My pulse sped up. That's impossible. I submitted everything to the city when I built it. He handed me a copy of the report. I scanned it, my vision blurring as I reached the final line. Permit status, revoked. I felt a wave of cold rage settle over me. There was only one person who could have pulled something like this. Margaret. Somehow, she had managed to weaponize the city government against me. I forced my voice to stay calm. This has to be a clerical error. The inspector shook his head. I can't make that call. The paperwork says the permit was revoked 2 days ago. 2 days ago. The same day Margaret got reinstated as HOA president. I clenched my jaw. She had been planning this. She knew I was going to fight her through the HOA, so she had gone above them, finding a way to attack me at the city level instead. And now, I was trapped. The inspector sighed. Look, I'm just doing my job. But legally speaking, if this gate is standing without an active permit, you're in violation of city code. I exhaled through my nose. What happens now? He flipped another page. You have 72 hours to either provide proof of reinstated permits or remove the structure. If you fail to comply, you could face fines of up to $1,000 per day until the violation is resolved. $1,000 per day. Margaret had won this round. I barely made it to the HOA meeting that evening. My mind was still spinning. Margaret was already waiting at the front of the community center, standing near the HOA board, looking annoyingly pleased with herself. The moment she saw me, her lips curled. Tough break about your permit, Carter. I stepped up to her, voice low. You pulled some serious strings to make that happen. She feigned innocence. I have no idea what you're talking about. Maybe if you actually followed regulations, this wouldn't have happened. My fists clenched. You're corrupt as hell, Margaret. She tilted her head. And yet, you're the one about to lose everything. She was right. It didn't matter that the entire community hated her. It didn't matter that I had a petition against her. Because while I had been fighting her through the HOA, she had been attacking me at a level I couldn't control. And now, she had outplayed me. The HOA vote still happened. Margaret lost. By the end of the night, she was officially removed from her position as HOA president. But it didn't matter, because my gate was still in violation of city code. And if I couldn't fix it in 72 hours, it had to come down. I drove home that night, hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Margaret had set me up to fail, and I wasn't going to let that happen. I had 72 hours, and I was going to use every second of it to make sure she didn't get the last laugh. I sat in my car outside my house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Margaret had just delivered the biggest blow yet. She had manipulated the city government, got my permit revoked, and now I had 72 hours before my gate had to be torn down, or I'd be fined into financial ruin. I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going down without a fight. I took a deep breath, walked into my house, and grabbed my binder, the one filled with every HOA bylaw, complaint, and property record I had collected over the past few months. But this time, I wasn't just looking for HOA violations. I was looking for a way to turn the city against Margaret. And after 2 hours of combing through property records and legal codes, I found it. Margaret's house was in violation of city zoning laws. It was almost poetic. Margaret had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade, and during that time, she had expanded her backyard fence. But she hadn't done it legally. According to city zoning laws, the fence was supposed to be at least 10 feet away from a protected drainage area. Margaret's fence? It was only 4 feet away, a direct violation of city code. And unlike my situation, where my permit had been revoked through shady backroom dealings, Margaret's violation had been on the books for years. All it took was one email to the building and zoning department, attaching her property records. As a concerned homeowner, I'd like to report a zoning violation at Margaret's address. I believe the property is not in compliance with city setback regulations, specifically regarding fence placement near protected drainage areas. I would appreciate an official review. I hit send. Now I waited. The next morning, I got a call, not from the city, but from Greg, one of the few HOA board members who had never fully supported Margaret. "Dude," he said the second I picked up. "What did you do?" I frowned. "What are you talking about?" Margaret's flipping out. "The city showed up at her house this morning. Something about a zoning violation on her property." I leaned back in my chair, letting the satisfaction wash over me. It worked. Margaret had tried to weaponize city inspectors against me. Now, the same system she abused was coming for her. I walked outside later that afternoon, just in time to see Margaret pacing in her driveway, phone pressed to her ear, looking like she was on the verge of a meltdown. I casually walked over, pretending not to notice her distress. She whirled toward me the second she saw me. "You did this." I raised an eyebrow. "Did what?" She jabbed a shaking finger toward her backyard. "The city is threatening to fine me for my fence." I feigned shock. "Wow. Sounds serious." Her face reddened with fury. "You think this is funny?" I crossed my arms. "Margaret, I'm just following rules. Isn't that what you always say?" She clenched her fists, practically vibrating with rage. "You think this means you win? You don't. The city already ruled on your gate. You still have to take it down." That's when I smiled. Because Margaret had no idea what was coming next. That evening, I got an email from the building and zoning department. They had reviewed my case. Turns out, the only reason my permit had been revoked was due to a technicality, a missing document from the city's database, which meant the revocation was invalid. I attached my original paperwork, refiled my permits, and within 12 hours, my gate was legally reinstated. Margaret had used the city against me, and now, the city had turned against her. The next morning, I walked outside just as a city inspector arrived at Margaret's house. She was already outside, arguing with him. "This is ridiculous. I've had that fence for years." The inspector remained unmoved. "And it's been in violation of city code for years. You need to apply for a variance, or remove it." Margaret's hands shook with barely contained fury. "This is harassment. Who even reported this?" The inspector didn't answer. "You have 72 hours to comply. Failure to do so will result in daily fines." I bit back a grin. 72 hours, the exact same deadline she had tried to give me. That evening, I saw her outside, staring at her fence, seething. She caught me watching, and for the first time since this war started, her face wasn't smug. It was defeated, because she knew I beat her. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with her own rules. She spent years weaponizing bureaucracy against a neighborhood, and in the end, it was bureaucracy that destroyed her. The next morning, Margaret's fence was gone. I made sure to water my lawn at the exact moment the contractors tore it down, standing there with my morning coffee, enjoying the show. She refused to look at me, but I saw the way her shoulders tensed when I said, "Wow, what a shame. I thought it really added to the neighborhood aesthetics." She stormed inside, slamming the door behind her. And for the first time since this nightmare started, the neighborhood finally felt peaceful. Margaret was officially powerless. But she wasn't done yet. Because just when I thought this was over, she made one last, desperate move. And this time, it wasn't just about the HOA. She wanted me gone. For the first time since this nightmare started, I thought it was finally over. Margaret had been removed from the HOA. She had lost her battle with the city. And her precious illegal fence had been torn down. She had no power left. Or so I thought. Because Margaret wasn't the type to accept defeat. And her final move, it was the most unhinged thing she had ever done. It started subtly. Small things at first. I didn't even connect them to her. One morning, I went outside to grab the newspaper and noticed my trash bins had been overturned. Garbage was strewn all over my lawn. Annoying, yes, but things like this happened. I cleaned it up and didn't think much of it. Then, a few nights later, I woke up to the sound of scratching outside my house. When I checked the security cameras, I saw nothing. But the next morning, I found deep gouge marks along my fence, like someone had taken a metal rake to it. It was deliberate. Still, I had no proof it was Margaret. Then things got worse. I received an anonymous letter in the mail. No return address. No signature. Just a single piece of paper with 3 words, "Get out now." I felt my stomach tighten. This wasn't HOA harassment anymore. This was personal. The breaking point came when I caught her in the act. It was around 2 a.m., and once again, my security cameras triggered an alert. I opened the feed, expecting to see nothing, just like before. Instead, there she was. Margaret. She was lurking near my mailbox, wearing a dark hoodie, something totally unlike her usual put-together, professional image. And in her hands, she was holding a can of spray paint. I immediately grabbed my phone and called the police. While I waited, I watched her on the screen, my blood boiling. She was spray painting something on my fence. Then, as if she had heard the sirens approaching, she bolted, running back toward her house. She didn't make it. The police arrived in under 2 minutes and caught her mid-sprint. It was over. I walked outside just as the officers grabbed her by the arm, stopping her escape. She was breathing heavily, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal. One officer looked at me. "Is this your property?" I nodded, crossing my arms. "Yep. And I have security footage of her trespassing." Margaret's head snapped toward me, her face twisting in fury. "You set me up," she shrieked. I stared at her. "Margaret, you're literally holding a can of spray paint." The officer looked at her hands, then at my fence. In big, dripping red letters, Margaret had painted, "Neighborhood scum." There was no getting out of this. As they handcuffed her, she lost it. I was protecting this community. He doesn't belong here. I let out a dry laugh. That's rich, coming from someone who just vandalized private property. The officer sighed. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent." Margaret screamed the entire time they put her in the patrol car. Threats, insults, wild claims about suing everyone. But it didn't matter. Because this time, there were real consequences. She was charged with trespassing, vandalism, harassment, and, since she was already on thin ice from the property damage incident with her SUV, the judge denied her bail. For the first time in her life, Margaret had no way out. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Margaret had been arrested again, and this time, people were celebrating. The Facebook group exploded with comments. "I can't believe she actually got arrested. Justice, finally. Good riddance. That woman was a menace." But my favorite, "I hope she enjoys her new HOA in prison." Because Margaret wasn't coming back from this. For 2 days after Margaret's arrest, the neighborhood felt different. Quieter. Lighter. It was the first time in months that I didn't feel like I had to check my security cameras every 5 minutes. I thought it was over. I was wrong. Because Margaret wasn't done yet. In her final act, it was the most unhinged thing she had ever done. It happened on the 3rd night after her arrest. I was sitting in my living room, half watching TV, when I heard it, a sharp metallic clatter from outside. Then a low creaking noise, like metal straining under pressure. I immediately pulled up my security cameras. What I saw, I thought I was hallucinating. Margaret was back, and she was standing in front of my gate, with a crowbar. My blood went cold. She had just been arrested for vandalizing my property. And now, she was back, escalating to full-on destruction. I grabbed my phone and called 911 immediately. As the dispatcher answered, I kept watching the screen, unable to believe what I was seeing. Margaret was prying at the hinges of my gate, her movements erratic, desperate. Her hair was a mess. She was still wearing the same outfit from her mugshot. And her eyes were wild, like she had lost all reason. Like she had snapped completely. I didn't wait. I stepped outside, phone in hand. Margaret dropped the crowbar. She spun around, eyes flashing with pure rage. "You ruined my life," she shrieked. "I had everything, and now I have nothing, because of you." I held my ground. "Margaret, you did this to yourself." Her hands tightened around the crowbar. And for the first time, I saw it, the moment she actually considered using it on me. For a few long, agonizing seconds, she just stood there, shaking, breathing heavily, her knuckles white against the metal. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of sirens. Margaret heard them too, her face twisted with something between rage and despair. Then, without another word, she dropped the crowbar and ran. She didn't make it far. The police arrived within seconds. And this time, there was no screaming, no threats, no theatrics. Just a silent, broken woman being shoved into the back of a squad car. And just like that, Margaret was gone, for good. The next morning, I got the final update. Margaret had been charged with felony property damage, trespassing, and violating her restraining order. And because she was already on probation from her previous charges, she wasn't getting out this time. She was facing actual jail time, not fines, not community service. Jail. By the end of the week, The neighborhood finally moved on. The HOA board elected a new president, someone who actually cared about the community. The Facebook group became a real resource for homeowners, not just a complaint forum. And me? I kept my gate, legally, permanently. The symbol of everything Margaret tried and failed to destroy. A month later, I got a final update on Margaret. She had sold her house, from behind bars. She wasn't coming back. She was gone for good. And just like that, the HOA dictator had fallen, forever. The neighborhood finally felt like home again. The air was lighter, the streets quieter, and the people friendlier. Margaret's reign of terror was over, and the community had come together to rebuild what she had tried to destroy. As for me, I learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, the only way to fight a bully is to use their own weapons against them. Margaret thought she could control everything. The HOA, the city, even the people around her. But in the end, she was brought down by the very system she had manipulated for so long. And as I stood in my driveway, looking at my reinforced steel gate, still standing strong, I couldn't help but smile. Because sometimes, the best victories are the ones you have to fight for. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.